You're making me look bad." Those were the first words my boss Graham Whitehead said to me after I closed the biggest contract in our company's history. I sat across from him in his corner office at Riverton Design Group, watching him tap his expensive pen against his mahogany desk. The contract I'd just signed would keep our architectural firm running for 3 years straight. Instead of congratulations, I got this. "My name is Elliot Crane. I'm 42 years old, and I've been the lead architect here for 8 years. I'd just spent 6 months convincing the West Side Development Group to trust us with their $50 million shopping complex project. The commission alone would pay my mortgage for 2 years." But Graham wasn't celebrating. "This isn't about individual success, Elliot," he continued, his voice getting that sharp edge I'd been hearing more often lately. "It's about team balance. You're disrupting the harmony we've worked so hard to build here." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Through his glass office walls, I could see the rest of our team at their desks. My colleague Pascal Vega was reviewing blueprints I'd helped him design. Our junior architect Sophia Klein was working on renderings for a project I'd brought her onto. None of them had any idea what Graham was about to tell me. The irony hit me like a brick wall. My success had literally kept our firm alive while half our competitors went bankrupt last year. "I'm recommending your termination, effective immediately." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire I hadn't seen coming. Graham delivered them with the same tone he'd used to order coffee. Flat. Businesslike. Cold. I felt my chest tighten as the reality sank in. "Termination?" I managed to say, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Graham, you can't be serious. I just brought in $50 million worth of work." He shuffled some papers on his desk, avoiding my eyes. "The decision has been made. Human resources will handle the paperwork. Security will escort you out within the hour." I looked around his office, taking in the awards on his walls. 3 of them were for projects I'd designed. The crystal sculpture from the Austin Business Journal sat on his bookshelf, recognition for the downtown tower project that I'd managed from start to finish. He'd accepted that award at the ceremony while I watched from the audience. Through the glass walls, I could see Pascal looking over at us with concern. Sophia had stopped working and was watching too. The whole office could sense something was wrong, but they had no idea their top performer was getting fired for being too good at his job. "Nothing personal," Graham said, finally looking up at me. "Just business." I stood up slowly, straightened my tie, and walked toward the door. My hands weren't shaking yet, but I knew they would be soon. I sat in my car in the Riverton parking lot for over an hour after security walked me out with a cardboard box of personal items. The Texas sun was beating down through my windshield, but I barely felt the heat. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. 8 years of my life. 8 years of 60-hour weeks, of missing my daughter's soccer games to meet deadlines, of building relationships with clients who trusted me with their biggest investments. All of it gone because Graham felt threatened by my success. But as I sat there watching my former colleagues through the office windows, something else started becoming clear. This wasn't just about Graham's insecurity. Over the past year, I'd noticed him taking credit for my work in client meetings. He'd started presenting my design concepts as his own ideas during investor pitches. When the West Side contract was being negotiated, he'd somehow convinced the board that it was his strategic vision that landed the deal. My phone buzzed with a text from my wife, Lauren. "How did the contract signing go?" I stared at the message, not sure how to respond. How do you tell your family that you got fired for doing your job too well? How do you explain that success can be more dangerous than failure when you work for someone who sees your achievements as threats to his reputation? I started my car and drove home through Austin traffic, already planning what I'd tell Lauren and the kids. The call came at 7:30 the next morning while I was drinking coffee and trying to figure out how to explain my situation to our mortgage company. "Elliot, this is Kendra Lowe from West Side Development." Her voice sounded confused, maybe a little annoyed. "I just got the strangest phone call from someone named Graham Whitehead. He introduced himself as my new lead architect and said you were no longer with Riverton." I felt my stomach drop. Kendra and I had worked together for 6 months building trust for this project. She knew every detail of my design philosophy, had seen my previous work, had specifically requested me for this contract. "That's correct," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm no longer with Riverton Design Group." There was a long pause. "Elliot, can you help me understand something?" This Graham person spent 15 minutes on the phone trying to convince me that he'd been involved in our project from the beginning. He talked about strategic oversight and collaborative vision. But I've never heard his name before yesterday. I closed my eyes and rubbed my temples. Graham was moving fast, trying to take over my client relationships before word could spread about what had really happened. He also seemed to think I'd be fine with him taking over, Kendra continued. But frankly, I chose Riverton because I wanted to work with you specifically. Your portfolio, your approach to sustainable design, your understanding of our timeline. That's what sold me on this partnership. My coffee was getting cold, but I didn't care. This conversation was about to change everything. By 9 a.m., my phone was ringing nonstop. Pascal Vega called first, his voice tight with worry. What the hell happened yesterday? Graham called an emergency team meeting and said you'd been terminated for performance issues. Half the office knows that's complete garbage. I could hear the anger in his voice. Pascal had been my closest colleague for 5 years. He'd watched me bring in client after client, seen me mentor junior architects, knew exactly how much revenue I generated for the firm. It gets worse, Pascal continued. Graham's calling himself the lead architect on the West Side project now. He's having Sophia redo all the client presentations with his name on them instead of yours. Within an hour, 3 other team members had called. They were all asking the same questions. How could the company's top performer get fired? What did this mean for their own job security? If Riverton could dispose of me for being too successful, who would be next? Sophia called crying. Elliot, I don't understand. You brought me onto 3 major projects this year. You taught me everything I know about commercial design. Graham barely spoke to me before yesterday, and now he wants me to pretend you were never involved. The picture was becoming clearer. Graham wasn't just covering up my termination. He was trying to erase me completely. He wanted to take credit for my work, claim my client relationships, and rewrite history so it looked like he'd been the driving force behind our firm's recent success. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated how much loyalty I'd built with both my colleagues and my clients. That afternoon, Pascal showed up at my house carrying a thick manila folder and wearing the most serious expression I'd ever seen on his face. You need to see this, he said, spreading documents across my Kit Klein table. I've been keeping records for the past 2 years, ever since I started noticing some concerning patterns. What he showed me took my breath away. Printed emails showing Graham claiming credit for my designs in communications with investors. Presentation slides with my architectural concepts labeled as Graham Whitehead Originals. Meeting notes where Graham presented himself as the creative force behind projects I conceived and managed. This one's from the Riverside Mall project, Pascal said, pointing to a document. Graham told the investors that the sustainable energy design was his breakthrough idea. But look at this. He pulled out another paper. My original sketches and calculations, dated 3 months earlier. The evidence went back years. Graham had been systematically stealing credit for my work and presenting it as his own innovation. He'd used my successes to build his reputation with the board and with potential investors, all while I focused on doing the actual work. There's more, Pascal said grimly. I talked to people in accounting. Graham's been getting bonuses based on these false performance claims. He's literally been paid extra money for work you did. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. This wasn't just about an insecure boss taking credit. This was fraud on a massive scale, affecting bonuses, promotions, and investor relationships. What are you going to do? Pascal asked. I looked at the evidence spread across my table and smiled for the first time in 24 hours. 2 days later, I met Pascal, Sophia, and 3 other key team members at a small diner across town. We chose a place far from Riverton's usual lunch spots, somewhere we could talk without being overheard. One by one, they each slid identical envelopes across the table toward me. Resignation letters, all dated for the same day, all citing loss of confidence in management leadership. We've been talking, Sophia said quietly. If they can fire you for being too good at your job, then none of us are safe. Graham's going to keep taking credit for our work and throwing us under the bus whenever it's convenient. Pascal nodded. We've all seen how he operates now. The evidence you showed us opened our eyes. He's been stealing from all of us, not just you. Jake Westside, our structural engineer, leaned forward. I've been with Riverton for 12 years. I thought loyalty mattered. But watching how they treated you made me realize that competence and loyalty don't protect you from a boss who sees you as a threat. They'd all made the same decision independently, but they were coordinating their departures for maximum impact. 6 of Riverton's most talented people would walk out together, leaving Graham scrambling to handle the workload. "There's one more thing," Pascal said, pulling out his phone. "I've been documenting everything Graham's done since you were fired. The lies he's told clients, the way he's trying to take credit for your projects. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." I looked around the table at these people who were willing to sacrifice their job security to make a stand against fraud and incompetence. The phone call started the next morning. Kendra Lowe from West Side Development called first, and she was furious. "Elliot, I need you to explain something to me. This Graham person called yesterday wanting to discuss modifications to our project timeline. He seemed to think we needed to start over with the design process because there might be structural issues with the current plans." I felt my jaw clench. Graham was sabotaging my work to justify his takeover of the project. He also couldn't answer basic questions about the sustainability features we discussed. Kendra continued. "When I asked about the solar panel integration, he said he'd have to check with his team." "Elliot, those were your ideas. You spent hours explaining how they'd reduce operating costs by 30%. Within 2 hours, I'd received similar calls from 2 other major clients. The Patterson Shopping Center project, which I'd been developing for 8 months, was suddenly experiencing communication problems with Riverton. The West Side office complex client was confused about why their primary contact had changed without notification. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Graham had called to introduce himself as their new lead architect, but he couldn't answer detailed questions about projects he'd never actually worked on. Clients who had built relationships with me over months were being told to start fresh with someone who barely understood their needs. "I have a question," said Marta Williams from Patterson Development. "Would you be interested in completing our project independently? Because frankly, I'd rather work with you directly than deal with this confusion at Riverton." That's when I realized Graham's desperate power grab was creating an unexpected opportunity. That night, I spread everything out on my home office desk like a general planning a campaign. Client contact lists, project timelines, documentation of Graham's fraud, and most importantly, a detailed analysis of exactly what I brought to Riverton Design Group. Over 8 years, I'd been the primary architect on projects worth over $200 million. I'd brought in 60% of the firm's major clients through referrals and reputation. My sustainable design innovations had won awards that brought prestige and new business to the company. But Graham had made a fatal error. He assumed that because he controlled my employment, he also controlled my relationships and my reputation. He thought clients worked with Riverton because of the company name, not because of individual architects they trusted. I started making a list. Every investor I'd built rapport with during project presentations. Every client who had specifically requested me for their projects. Every industry contact who knew my work and my reputation. Graham could steal my job, but he couldn't steal 8 years of relationship building. My wife Lauren found me still working at 2 a.m. "What are you planning?" she asked. I looked up at her and smiled. "I'm not planning revenge. I'm planning success." Graham wanted me gone because he thought I was threatening his position. He's about to find out what losing me actually costs. The plan wasn't complicated. I was going to start my own firm, take my clients with me, and let Graham try to run Riverton on stolen credit and empty promises. Monday morning arrived like a thunderstorm. Pascal called me at 8:15 a.m., barely able to contain his laughter. "You should see Graham's face right now," he said. He just walked into the office and found 6 resignation letters on his desk. All dated today, all effective immediately. He's running around the office like his hair's on fire. The coordinated resignation was beautiful in its simplicity. Pascal, Sophia, Jake, and 3 others had cleaned out their desks over the weekend and left everything spotless. Their workstations looked like museum displays, with identical notes placed prominently. "We don't work for people who steal credit from their teams." Graham's calling it sabotage, Pascal continued. He's demanding to know who organized what he's calling a coordinated attack on company stability. Sophia told him we're all just individual employees making individual career decisions. By 9 a.m., Graham was pacing around the office, trying to figure out how to handle multiple major projects with half his design team gone. The West Side contract alone required a team of 6 architects, and he'd just lost 5 of his most experienced people. He called an emergency meeting with the remaining staff, Pascal reported. Tried to spin it as an opportunity for advancement. But everyone knows what's really happening. The rats are jumping off a sinking ship, and Graham's the reason it's sinking. I hung up and immediately started calling my former clients. It was time to let them know they had options. Within an hour, 3 major clients had expressed interest in following me to whatever firm I joined next. The investor meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at noon, and Graham was about to face his worst nightmare. The West Side Development Group wanted to discuss technical details of the shopping complex project, details that I had developed and that Graham had never actually learned. Pascal, who still had friends at Riverton, gave me a play-by-play afterward. It was painful to watch, he said. Graham walked into that conference room like he owned the place. But within 10 minutes, it was obvious he didn't understand the project. According to Pascal's sources, the investors asked about load-bearing calculations for the main structure. Graham fumbled, saying he'd need to consult his engineering team. When they asked about the sustainable energy systems that were central to the design, he started sweating through his expensive suit. The worst part was when they asked about timeline modifications, Pascal continued. Graham suggested they might need to start the design process over because there could be structural concerns with the current plans. The investors looked at each other like he was crazy. Kendra Lowe, who was in that meeting, called me directly afterward. Elliot, I need to ask you something. Would you be interested in starting your own firm? Because I'd rather terminate our contract with Riverton and work with you directly than deal with this incompetence. Other investors in the meeting had similar reactions. They'd chosen Riverton specifically to work with me, and Graham's obvious cluelessness was making them reconsider their entire partnership. By 3 p.m., Graham was back in his office making frantic phone calls, trying to do damage control with investors who were losing confidence in his ability to deliver. Kendra Lowe's offer was more generous than I'd expected. Start your own firm, she said during our phone call. Bring whatever team you want. My contract follows you, and I'll make sure other developers know about your new company. She wasn't the only one. Marta Williams from Patterson Development made a similar offer. So did 3 other major clients who had been working with me through Riverton. They all said the same thing. They had hired Elliot Crane, not Riverton Design Group. I've been in this business for 20 years, Kendra explained. I know the difference between a company and the people who actually do the work. You're the architect I trust with my $50 million project, not some boss who can't answer basic questions about sustainable design. By Thursday, I had enough client commitments to launch a firm immediately. The West Side contract alone would provide steady revenue for 3 years. Add the Patterson project and 2 smaller developments, and I'd be starting with more work than most architectural firms see in their first 2 years. I spent the evening researching business licenses, office space, and insurance requirements. Starting an architectural firm isn't simple, but I had something most new businesses lack: guaranteed clients from day one. My phone rang at 9 p.m. It was Sophia. Elliot, I heard rumors that you're starting your own company. I know I already resigned from Riverton, but would you consider hiring me? I'd rather work for someone I trust than spend months looking for another job with a boss who might turn out to be just like Graham. Pascal called an hour later with the same question. So did Jake. By midnight, I had 6 experienced architects ready to join whatever firm I decided to create. The floodgates opened on Friday morning. My phone rang every 20 minutes with calls from former clients, potential new clients, and industry contacts who had heard rumors about my situation. Word travels fast in Austin's development community, explained Timothy Rodriguez, a commercial real estate investor I'd worked with 2 years earlier. Everyone knows you were the real talent behind Riverton's recent success. Graham Whitehead's reputation is already taking a beating. Client after client called with similar messages. They didn't want to work with Riverton without me. They'd rather wait for me to establish my own firm than continue projects with Graham pretending to understand work he'd never actually done. The most satisfying call came from Harrison Blake, the CEO of West Side Development. Elliot, I've been watching this situation develop, and I want you to know that Graham called me yesterday trying to schedule a project review meeting. He couldn't answer basic questions about our timeline or budget requirements. It was embarrassing. Harrison had a proposition. I'm planning a major mixed-use development downtown. $50 million in construction, with potential for 2 additional phases. I was considering Riverton for the architectural work, but now I'd prefer to discuss it with your new firm. By noon, I had commitments worth over $100 million in potential projects. Clients weren't just following me. They were bringing new opportunities that Riverton would never have seen. I called Lauren at work. Honey, I think it's time to make this official. I'm starting Ironwood Studio. The name came to me suddenly. Strong, resilient, built to last. Everything Graham's leadership wasn't. Graham's panic was becoming visible to everyone at Riverton. Pascal, who was finishing his 2-week notice, reported that Graham was calling emergency meetings every day, desperately trying to figure out how to handle the client exodus. He's blaming everyone except himself, Pascal told me. Yesterday, he called you a traitor in front of the entire remaining staff. He said you were trying to sabotage Riverton out of spite. But Graham's biggest problem wasn't my supposed sabotage. It was his complete inability to deliver on projects he'd never actually worked on. The West Side contract required technical expertise he didn't possess. The Patterson project involved sustainable design innovations he couldn't explain to clients. HR is scrambling. Sophia reported from her final week at Riverton. Half the remaining architects are updating their resumes. Everyone can see that Graham's in over his head, and they don't want to be around when everything falls apart. Graham tried scheduling meetings with key clients, hoping to salvage relationships through personal charm. But charm doesn't work when clients ask technical questions about structural engineering and energy efficiency systems. The breaking point came when Marta Williams from Patterson Development called Riverton directly, asking to speak with whoever actually designed the sustainable features of her project. When Graham admitted that the original architect was no longer with the company, Marta asked if the project could still be completed on schedule. Graham's answer, "We might need to revisit some design elements," was the beginning of the end. Marta immediately called me to discuss moving the project to Ironwood Studio. The LinkedIn post went viral within hours. Pascal had anonymously uploaded a detailed breakdown of Graham's credit theft, complete with side-by-side comparisons of stolen designs and falsified performance reports. The post was titled, "How One Manager Destroyed His Company by Taking Credit for Work He Never Did." It included screenshots of emails where Graham claimed responsibility for my architectural concepts, presentation slides showing my designs labeled as his original ideas, and documentation of client meetings where he presented himself as the creative force behind projects I'd actually managed. Within 6 hours, the post had hundreds of shares and comments. Austin's architectural community is smaller than people realize, and everyone knew the players involved. Industry professionals were sharing their own stories about working with both Graham and me, comparing our actual knowledge and capabilities. "This explains so much," wrote one comment from a structural engineer who had worked with Riverton. "I always wondered how Graham could take credit for such innovative, sustainable designs when he clearly didn't understand the technical requirements." Another comment came from a former Riverton client. "I specifically asked to work with Elliot Crane on my project. Graham tried to convince me he had been equally involved in the design process, but it was obvious he didn't know the details." The post spread beyond Austin's architectural community. Business professionals in other industries started sharing it as an example of toxic management and credit theft. Graham's name was becoming associated with fraud and incompetence on a very public platform. By evening, local business journalists were reaching out to me for interviews about the situation. The collapse happened faster than anyone expected. Within 1 week of the LinkedIn post going viral, Riverton lost 3 major clients worth over $70 million in contracted work. The West Side Development Group officially terminated their contract, citing inability to provide qualified architectural leadership for the project scope. They immediately signed with Ironwood Studio instead. Patterson Development followed within 48 hours, as did West Side Development. But the real damage was just beginning. Potential clients who had been considering Riverton started calling other firms instead. The company's reputation for innovation and reliability, built largely on my work, was evaporating now that everyone knew Graham had been taking false credit. "They're hemorrhaging money," Pascal reported from his final day at Riverton. "Graham's called 3 emergency board meetings this week." The remaining staff can hear shouting from the conference room. 2 more senior architects resigned, unable to handle the workload that 6 people had previously managed. The office felt empty, with more vacant desks than occupied ones. Graham tried damage control by hiring a crisis management consultant, but the consultant's first recommendation was to publicly acknowledge the credit theft and implement new policies for project attribution. Graham refused, still insisting that everything was just disgruntled employee sabotage. Meanwhile, Ironwood Studio was fielding more client inquiries than we could handle. Word was spreading that Austin's most talented architectural team had left Riverton to start something better. Local business publications were starting to pick up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about management fraud and the importance of recognizing individual contributions in professional settings. Ironwood Studio's official launch exceeded every expectation I'd had. We opened our offices in a renovated warehouse downtown, with natural light, collaborative workspaces, and room for the team to grow. Pascal became my partner and lead structural engineer. Sophia took charge of sustainable design innovation. Jake handled project management. The team that had made Riverton successful was now working together without interference from incompetent management. Our first month brought in more contracted work than most architectural firms see in their first year. The West Side project alone provided steady revenue, but new clients were approaching us weekly. Developers wanted to work with the team that had actually created Riverton's award-winning designs. It's amazing how much more productive we are without Graham constantly taking credit for our work, Sophia observed during our first team meeting. I'm actually excited about coming to work again. The difference was remarkable. Without toxic management, without credit theft, without someone undermining our relationships with clients, we were able to focus entirely on creating exceptional architectural solutions. Investors were taking notice too. Harrison Blake introduced us to other developers in his network. Kendra Lowe recommended us for 2 additional shopping complex projects. Word-of-mouth referrals were bringing opportunities we never would have seen at Riverton. Austin Business Journal featured us in their Companies to Watch section, highlighting our rapid growth and innovative approach to sustainable commercial design. Meanwhile, Riverton was struggling to complete even basic projects without the team that had actually been doing the work. The article hit Austin Business Journal's front page on a Tuesday morning. Local architecture firms' success built on stolen credit and management fraud. The journalist had done extensive research, interviewing former clients, current and former employees, and industry professionals who had worked with both Riverton and Ironwood Studio. The picture that emerged was damning for Graham and vindicated everything we'd been saying. Multiple sources confirmed that Graham Whitehead systematically claimed credit for architectural designs and client relationships developed by subordinates, the article stated. This pattern of false attribution continued for several years and directly influenced performance evaluations, bonus calculations, and investor presentations. The article included quotes from clients who had specifically chosen Riverton to work with me, only to discover that Graham couldn't answer basic questions about projects he claimed to have designed. It detailed the mass resignation of Riverton's core team and the subsequent client exodus to Ironwood Studio. Most importantly, it positioned the story as a broader cautionary tale about toxic management practices in professional services. The Riverton case demonstrates how credit theft and management fraud can destroy a company's reputation and drive away both talent and clients. The article concluded. Graham's name was now permanently associated with professional misconduct in Austin's business community. The article was shared extensively on social media, with local professionals commenting on their own experiences with similar management problems. Within hours of publication, 2 more Riverton clients had called Ironwood Studio to discuss transferring their projects. The board meeting happened on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning Graham Whitehead was no longer employed at Riverton Design Group. Pascal still had contacts inside the company who reported that Graham's suspension was immediate and decisive. The board finally saw the financial damage, one source reported. They lost over $4 million in contracted work in 2 weeks. Client relationships built over years were destroyed. Their reputation in Austin's development community was in ruins. The investigation had uncovered the full scope of Graham's deception. Years of falsified performance reports, stolen credit for architectural innovations, and misrepresentation of his role in client relationships. The board realized that their successful sales manager had actually been a fraud who had driven away the people responsible for the company's real achievements. Rumors started circulating about potential criminal charges. Taking credit for work in professional services can constitute fraud, especially when it affects contracts, bonuses, and investor relationships. Graham's systematic deception had financial consequences that extended beyond simple workplace politics. He's hired a lawyer, Pascal reported. Word is that several former clients are considering lawsuits for misrepresentation during contract negotiations. Meanwhile, Riverton's remaining staff were openly discussing whether the company could survive. Without Graham's mismanagement, but also without the core architectural team, they were struggling to complete existing projects while their reputation continued to deteriorate. The company that had once been Austin's premier architectural firm was now a cautionary tale about what happens when incompetent management destroys talent instead of nurturing it. Graham's desperate phone call came on a Wednesday evening while I was reviewing blueprints for our latest project. His name appeared on my caller ID, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Elliot, we need to talk." His voice sounded different, smaller, defeated. Gone was the arrogant confidence he'd displayed when firing me 6 months earlier. "I'm not sure we have anything to discuss, Graham. Please, just listen. This has gotten out of hand. I know you're angry about how things ended, but you're destroying me. My reputation, my career, everything I've worked for." I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair. "Graham, I didn't destroy anything. I started my own company and took my clients with me. That's not destruction, that's business. You know it's more than that. The LinkedIn posts, the media attention, turning my own team against me. You orchestrated all of this." "I didn't orchestrate anything," I said calmly. "I just stopped letting you take credit for my work. Everything that happened after that was a natural consequence of your own actions." There was a long pause. "What do you want? Money? A public apology? Just tell me what it will take to make this stop." "Graham, this stopped being about what I want months ago. You made your choices when you decided to steal credit for other people's work. You can't undo those consequences by asking nicely." "Elliot, please." I hung up. Some conversations aren't worth having. The contract presentation took place in Riverton's former conference room, now occupied by the skeleton crew trying to keep the company afloat. Ironwood Studio had been invited to bid on the Austin Gateway project, a $200 million mixed-use development that represented the largest commercial contract in the city's recent history. What made the presentation especially sweet was that I was presenting the same sustainable design concepts that Graham had claimed as his own innovations for 3 years. But now I was presenting them as the original architect, with full technical knowledge and genuine passion for the environmental impact. The development board included several people who had worked with both Riverton and Ironwood Studio. They could see the difference between someone who actually understood sustainable architecture and someone who had merely been taking credit for it. "Mr. Crane," said the lead investor, "these energy efficiency projections are impressive. Can you walk us through the technical specifications for the solar integration system?" I spent 20 minutes detailing every aspect of the design, answering complex questions about load distribution, energy storage, and long-term maintenance requirements. These were concepts I had developed, refined, and implemented on multiple projects. After our presentation, the board voted unanimously to award the contract to Ironwood Studio. The same day, they made the decision to formally dissolve what remained of Riverton Design Group. Graham's company, built on stolen credit and fraudulent performance claims, was officially dead. The talented architects who had made it successful were thriving without him, while he was left with nothing but the consequences of his own deception. The foreclosure notice appeared in the legal section of Austin Business Journal 3 months later. Graham Whitehead's house, the expensive showcase home he'd bought with bonuses earned from my stolen work, was being repossessed by the bank. Pascal forwarded me the listing with a simple message. "Karma's a harsh teacher." But the house was just the beginning. Graham's wife had filed for divorce shortly after his termination from Riverton, citing irreconcilable differences and financial irresponsibility. Industry contacts reported that she discovered the full extent of his professional fraud during the divorce proceedings and wanted to distance herself from the legal liability. The investor lawsuits were multiplying. 3 different development groups were suing Graham personally for misrepresentation during contract negotiations. They argued that his false claims about designing their projects constituted fraud that had influenced their business decisions. His professional architect's license was under review by the state board, with multiple former clients and colleagues filing formal complaints about his credit theft and project misrepresentation. Graham's LinkedIn profile, once filled with glowing recommendations and project showcases, had quietly disappeared. His professional network had evaporated as word spread about his systematic deception. Meanwhile, Ironwood Studio was hiring additional architects to handle our growing client base. We'd become one of Austin's most sought-after architectural firms, built on genuine talent, honest client relationships, and innovative design work. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. Graham's empire of stolen credit had collapsed completely, while the people whose work he'd stolen were more successful than ever. 1 year after launching Ironwood Studio, we moved into a custom-designed office tower that showcased our architectural philosophy. The building featured all the sustainable innovations I developed over my career: solar integration, natural lighting systems, energy-efficient climate control, and green roofing technology. Local business publications featured our growth story regularly. From fired to thriving. How one architect turned career sabotage into business success, read one headline. Austin's fastest-growing architecture firm built on talent, not credit theft, read another. Our client testimonials spoke volumes about the difference between working with people who actually did the work versus managers who just claimed credit for it. Elliot and his team don't just understand our vision, they improve it, wrote Kendra Lowe in a public recommendation. This is what professional architecture should look like. We'd grown from 6 founding members to 22 employees, all carefully selected for their talent, integrity, and collaborative approach. No one person took credit for team achievements, but everyone received recognition for their individual contributions. The contrast with Graham's management style was deliberate and obvious. We'd created the kind of workplace that valued competence over politics, innovation over credit theft, and long-term success over short-term ego protection. Industry awards followed our client success. Austin Business Journal named us Architecture Firm of the Year. The Texas Environmental Council recognized our sustainable design innovations. Most satisfying of all, we won the Ethical Business Practices Award from the local Better Business Bureau. Graham's name, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale in management training seminars about the dangers of credit theft and toxic leadership. The criminal charges became public record 6 months later. Graham Whitehead had been formally indicted for fraud and misrepresentation in connection with his systematic theft of employee work product and falsification of performance reports to investors. The indictment detailed years of documented deception. Claiming credit for architectural designs he hadn't created, misrepresenting his role in client relationships to justify bonus payments, and providing false information to investors about his contributions to major projects. This case represents a clear pattern of professional fraud that directly impacted business relationships and financial decisions, the prosecutor stated in a press release. Mr. Whitehead's actions constituted deliberate misrepresentation for personal financial gain. The charges carried potential penalties of up to 10 years in prison and substantial financial restitution to affected parties. Multiple former clients had provided testimony about how Graham's false claims had influenced their business decisions. More devastating for Graham personally, the local architectural licensing board had permanently revoked his professional credentials. He was banned from practicing architecture in Texas and would need to disclose his fraud conviction when applying for licenses in other states. The man who had fired me for making him look bad was now unemployable in the industry he'd spent 20 years building his career in. His LinkedIn profile remained deleted, his professional network had abandoned him, and his reputation was permanently associated with fraud and credit theft. Local business schools were already using his case as a study in how toxic management and professional dishonesty can destroy careers and companies. Today, I stood on the balcony of Ironwood Studios headquarters, looking out over Austin's skyline. The city was growing rapidly, and our firm was helping shape that growth through innovative, sustainable design. We'd just been selected as the lead architectural firm for Austin's new convention center, a $300 million project that would define the city's downtown landscape for decades. The client specifically chose us because of our reputation for honest business practices and architectural excellence. My phone buzzed with a text from Pascal. Graham's bankruptcy filing made the business journal today. Officially lost everything. I didn't feel satisfaction anymore, just a quiet sense of justice. Graham Whitehead had destroyed his own life through greed, insecurity, and systematic dishonesty. My success hadn't caused his downfall. His own character flaws had. The real victory wasn't Graham's destruction. It was building something better. Ironwood Studio employed 35 architects, engineers, and designers who felt valued for their contributions. Our clients trusted us because we delivered on promises instead of making excuses. Our reputation was built on authentic achievement rather than stolen credit. Sometimes the best revenge isn't planning someone's downfall. It's simply being so successful that their incompetence becomes impossible to hide. Graham had tried to suppress my talent because he thought it threatened his position. Instead, he'd freed me to build something that made his fraudulent empire look pathetic by comparison. The greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's discovering you don't need them to succeed. And sometimes, justice is just watching incompetent people destroy themselves while you build something beautiful.